Do you remember when we met?
I do. At the conference in Minneapolis.
Yeah. And it became very obvious to me very quickly that I didn't know as much about you as I should. I've always kind of prided I've so I always prided myself in being pretty well read and, knowing my standards, if you will. And we were on a bus together going to a baseball game, and we were
Yep.
talking, and I realized that you were Kathy Daniel Miller's partner. And I'd been really heavily influenced by one of your proteges, that I had worked with. And but what struck me right away was, like, you didn't spend a lot of time, like, trying to tell me everything that I should know about you. You were kind of curious, and you were kind of interested in me, and interested in the work and kind of where it came from, and we kind of established this kind of mentor relationship.
One of the things you triggered in, what do I believe and how do I believe what I believe? And the phrase face validity came to mind as I was reading your questions. And
Mhm.
face validity answers the question, how do you know something's true? Without quantitative data. When I was in graduate school, we had the quant jocks, the rat runners, the statistical,
Mhm.
experimental. Got to, if you can't prove it statistically, it isn't true. And then you had the practitioners who said, if it stands the test of time, it has face validity. You may
Mhm.
not be able to quantitatively differentiate it from 50 other things, but it holds water, it sustains itself, right? And so it has face validity. And so when people would say to me, well, I mean, that's a really old model. DVF, really old model, right? It's DVF as a concept, as a model, has been around for 50 years. It doesn't go away because it has a certain amount of face validity to it that helps explain something. In lieu of some other explanation, it's as good as any.
Mhm.
And so over the years, the test of time, there are some things that I say I believe because they stand the test of time. So when I was looking at your questions, I was thinking about, one of the gifts that you get when you get older and you reflect back is there are certain things that stand the test of time,
Yeah.
right? DVF, three eyes, other things like that, and those are the things that you begin to hold true. It really got me thinking about why do I believe what I believe? And I'm not a researcher, right? I'm a
Mhm.
practitioner. And so I'm looking for face validity. So when you start to unpack resistance, it's a much more important concept than we actually ever give it credit for. Mostly it's considered a pain in the ass, right?
Right.
One of the stories in the book, which I think I might have told you in one of our phone calls, was about a guy who we had a large group meeting. Everybody was mandated to be at this big hotel ballroom. Everybody had an assigned seat, assigned table, a max mix. Everything was very structured and organized. One guy came and sat in the back of the room and pulled out his newspaper, refused to go to his table, wouldn't have any part of it, but he'd been mandated to be there, so he had to show up. Didn't mean he had to go to his table, though. So he just sat in the back of the room, reading his newspaper, basically saying, screw you to
Yeah.
everybody, right? I was quite upset about it. And I went up to Dana Miller and I said, look at that guy. Look at that idiot. What the hell's he doing? Somebody should go get him to his table. Right? His table's missing his voice. And she just looked at me like, you're crazy. And I said, what do you mean? She said, if you go there and confront him, he will only resist you more.
Mm.
When the spirit moves him and the conversation is important enough for him to want to be a part of it, he'll move. I thought, I'm not so sure about that. He's just being counter independent and nobody's willing to confront him, kind of thing. Next morning, maybe an hour or two after the meeting had started on the second day, I happened to glance in the back of the room and the guy wasn't there. He wasn't at the table reading his newspaper. And I thought, I wonder where he is. And I went to Daniel and I said, where, did you see the guy's not there? He said, this table, right? The
Yeah.
conversation had turned to the point where he could choose for himself to move. If I'd
Hmm.
have tried to confront him, I would have made it worse with him, and I probably would have made it worse for others who were watching the interaction, right?
Right.
Letting him be in his resistance and use that energy, right, and have him choose it, the most powerful thing you could do. Right? The worst thing a guy could have done in that moment is to actually try to get him back to quote where I thought, you know, the authority had assigned him to table number blah blah blah.
This idea of like channeling resistance, you talk a lot about the idea that people will support what they help create,
Mm.
um, which I think you've written a lot about. It's easy to learn. It's easy to get access to, the body of work that you've produced on that. But I'm interested, how did you come to that insight?
Resistance is an alternative point of view. And from a change perspective, the more points of view you get, the more robust your picture becomes, the more visibility you get into the possibilities. And so if you don't find resistance, I even encourage it,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's divergent thinking, right? It's
Right.
somebody, and so I think you need divergent thinking in order to inform creative thinking. If you don't do that, you're just spinning your wheels in some way. So the other reason to really understand and embrace resistance is it's a divergent point of view. And the more one can embrace it and understand it, the bigger the view you get. When you combine, Dana Miller used to call it multiple realities. When you
Mhm.
combine those multiple realities, you get a better sense of the whole, right? And so resistance is just being able to look under another rock and get a different point of view about the system. You see things other people see in addition to the things you see. So you get a more holistic perspective, right? So not encouraging resistance, not creating divergent thinking, not enabling people to push against these things. They don't help the change process. Right? They actually slow it down, right? And I
Mhm.
think in many, many ways. One of the things I discovered actually just a few years ago is resistance is a chemical neurological reaction in the brain. It's not an emotion. We think of resistance as an emotion or an attitude, right? It's actually like fear, anxiety, and other things. It's a chemical reaction in the brain that is evolved over the millenniums in order to keep us safe. So people who resist aren't always or necessarily doing it because they wanna. They're doing it
Yeah.
because the brain is telling them something's amiss, and in order to be safe, you need to do blah 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 blah. Those of us that created large group methods way back in the day, the Axelrods, Marv Weisbord, myself, and Dana Miller, as the guy from Participative Design, his name was Bob Ream, and people kept trying to get us to compete against each other, right? Like whose method is the best method,
Mhm.
and actually in Harrison Owen, right? It's is open space better than, well, I use open space, well, I use full scale. Well, and so we said rather than differentiating, it would be helpful to understand what underlies the commonality and what are the common beliefs that we have that are driving our different methodologies. Because essentially they're all trying to get to the same end, which is give people voice. And in this, we had a couple day get together after one of the large group conferences with the question of what's at the heart of it. What are the underlying principles that we all adhere to? And and the phrase that we created was people own what they create. So in that conversation emerged that phrase, right? Because it was when you look at what is it that we believe, what's driving the approach, what's driving the approach is the hypothesis that people own that which they create. Ownership and commitment can't be bought, can't be sold, can only be co-created and shared, right? And so, so I think the first time it really crystallized was in that conversation with the other four people, right? That, it's a hypothesis. The hypothesis is people own that which they help create. Go back to our earlier conversation about face validity. It's proved itself to be true over and over and over again. And so it becomes more than a belief, right? It's a tested hypothesis. If you want commitment, there's only way you can get it. You can't finesse it. You can't buy it. You can't sell it with a good slide deck, right? It only comes when people embrace it and own it in whatever form that might look like. We were literally mapping the change process and saying, how many days did that take? 2 days for that, 5 days for this, 10 days for this, 100 days to sell it. So well, what if we could get rid of that 100 selling days? We could move the change 100 days faster. Mm. And it literally was that kind of engineering discussion that we had, Brandon, that said, if you follow an order through the process, right? Where does it sit the most? Where does it sit the longest? Where, if wasted time, wasted motion, or sitting on somebody's desk is one of the 17 ways, how do we eliminate that waste? And the answer was move the selling to the front. Mm-hmm. Don't wait till you get to the solution. What would selling it at the front look like? Well, we'll probably have to give people ideas and let them chew on them for a while and let them think about it. And, and that looks like building ownership and commitment. And so prior to this conversation with the other large group methods gang, I was literally going through that process with a client system at Corning Glass. And the conscious question was, if I have to reduce my cycle time for product manufacturing, how do we reduce the cycle time for change? Let's map the change process, create a event planning team, create an org design team, do benchmarking with 10 sites, 5 different meetings with the steering committee over excellence. Look at all of the days, minutes, and hours and figure out where's the opportunities, right? And how could we shrink it, eliminate it? How do we reduce the steps, make them faster, move them easier? And I was literally having that conversation with the plant manager and the assistant plant manager at this Corning Glass plant and saying, if we could re-engineer the process, the opportunity is mostly at the back end. After we get the idea, what if we already had ownership and commitment before we got to that? Yeah. And that was that sort of journey with those two guys in the plant manager's office over the course of a couple of evenings, over the course of a couple of months, got us to saying, what if we redesigned the design process so that we actually moved participation, the selling behaviors earlier into the process? Would that reduce the cycle time? Well, in the next project we did, we tried that. Lo and behold, face validity, boom, it worked, right? And so I was playing with it from an engineering point of view. I hadn't thought about it from a social system or a social psychological point of view. Ownership and commitment is a big part of the time consumption in any change process, right? Right. If it's not it may not, in some cases, it's the biggest time chunk. In other cases, it's maybe the second biggest. Sometimes finding the right solution right, might take longer or might take the same amount of time. So you have to believe that the wisdom is in the system in order to enable people to co-create solutions, because otherwise you'll be constantly worried that they're going to create suboptimal solutions. People who were against large group methods early on believed that what you were going to create was regression to the mean. You were going to create suboptimal solutions because the consensus among 300 people is going to be some suboptimal something. It's not the best of the best. It's okay or good, and we had to reprove every time we did something that in fact that's not the case. You can get the best of the best, right?
How did you come up with the concept of microcosms?
What Dana Miller discovered, Dana Miller's issue was patterns of conversation. And what she would say is if, two levels of people, the boss and their direct reports get together, they get habituated into a pattern of conversation. They ask the same questions. They know what not to talk about. They know what to talk about, right? They have their code words and stuff like that. And so they become habituated. And if you want, and as a result, they become slow to act and slow to change. Her idea was, what if you got 3 levels or 4 levels or 3 functions or 4 functions instead of 1? You bring down complexity, right? But it's hierarchical, structural, not mechanical or process, and have people have a conversation. And what you discover is when you engage 3, 4, 5 levels, the nature of the conversation changes. The person 3 levels up all of a sudden hears the point of view of somebody 3 levels down, which they probably didn't hear before, or at best heard it in a filtered kind of way.
Yeah.
Right. And so for Dana Miller, it's how do you change the conversation, right? And the way you change the conversation is by trying to break some of the old patterns, some of the old habits, some of the old ways of talking, working, etc. And her, when they first started doing this, they would do 2 levels. And I would be like, man, that's not going to get us anywhere. And they would do 3. Oh, that's better. And what if we did 4? Well, we still have all the workers to deal with. How do we get them involved? And how does the worker see the world that the leader sees? And how does the leader see the world the worker sees unless we can somehow bring them together? Well, we can't bring them all together. Well, okay, let's get 1 in 10 microcosm. Right.
But that's what I was thinking. It's like it's an acceptance of a constraint, but still implementing the concept of how do we engage cross section of the system.
It is a simply elegant, powerful tool for helping the system see itself. One of your questions was, what are the characteristics of a good org design, org development person? And I think one of my answers was systemic thinking. When I was trained, systemic thinking was people, process, technology, right? And complexity, however one defined that, right? So, so systemic thinking was more holistic. What differentiated org development from org design was org development in its early years was very much focused on group dynamics and individual behavior, right? Not on that individual's behavior in the context of some larger system. At best, it was a small group. That was the largest system, but it wasn't groups of groups, teams of teams, but I was trained by Eric Trist to think systemically, right? The research, the seminal stuff from the 40s and the 50s that he and his colleagues at Tavistock did continually reinforced the belief that you needed to think systemically about the situation and the condition in order to create better success. If you only focus on the technology, but you forget about the people, you're in trouble. If you only do the people, but you forget about the technology, somebody's going to come along with a better technology and put you out of business, right? So, so in their very simplified world, systems thinking was about embracing complexity and understanding the whole. And the next layer down from that is, how do you get that complexity into a situation where you could look at it, leverage it, and understand it? And the answer is it's embedded in people, right? And so the notion of the way you embrace the complexity of the system and the way you get systemic thinking is by including as much of the system as possible. The only vehicle and mechanism for doing that is people. People
Right.
bring their truths, they bring their experience, they bring their realities, they bring their functional beliefs, myopia, and the idea is to create a condition in which they can then see the rest of the system, because mostly you only see your little part. So the notion of a human system microcosm as the tool for whole system change comes from simply being a systemic thinker and leveraging theories and methodologies like socio-technical systems design and others like that, right? And it's sort of when you say, it's a complex situation. Well, the question is, well, how do you bring all that complexity into the room? It's a hypothesis about how I think things work or how I
Mhm.
think they should work that needs to get tested, right? And so when it becomes something other than a hypothesis, not when it becomes an answer and not a
Yeah.
hypothesis, right?
It's like not mechanistic. When you think about, like, you have to have a certain level of holding your theories and your tools and your paradigms loosely, because they're useful, not accurate. If you had two or three other things that you think are critical, what are the things that you found in the many people that you've mentored and worked with?
You know, when I saw your question, the very first answer is that your shine. It's called
Hmm.
humility, right? And
Hmm.
what differentiates really good consultants, irrespective of their technical consulting expertise or design or behavior, whatever it might be, is a sense of humility. And humility is trusting the wisdom of others, right? I mean, I think the best consultants I know are people who don't believe that they have the best answer, right? Second characteristic is they treat everything as a hypothesis. I've done change processes 25 times. You've done them 25 times. None of the two of them have ever been the same. But in them, there are things that we hold dear because we believe our hypothesis is that they're more effective than doing something else.
Hmm.
A different change effort or initiative or intervention could require something different than that, right? I think it's so humility is first and foremost. You have to believe that you're not the smartest person in the room, right? And that, and there's wisdom in the system. You have to treat everything as though it were an opinion or a hypothesis. Um, the third is you have to be willing to step to the edges of your own comfort zone. You have to challenge your own beliefs or put yourself in situations where your beliefs can be challenged, right? I mean, Tanner Miller and I would always say anything and everything is fair game. It just needs a good why. Why would you do that?
Hmm.
And why? I'm sort of asking, what's the underlying thinking? Another way of asking the hypothesis question, right?
Hmm.
And so if you don't have a good why, then any why will work. I've been very fortunate. I've ridden every wave that's come. In the 70s, it was socio-technical systems. And I was there because Eric was there. I was one
Hmm.
of the founders of, so I was one of the first early people to understand it and apply it. And I applied it in a way that I saw Eric do it, which was not prescriptive, not linear. It was action research, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't some codified 9-step approach. It was action research, right? And so, so I rode the socio-technical systems road. And then I got disenfranchised with that. And I rode the total quality management. I went to Japan. I purposely
Mhm.
went to Japan because what I saw we were doing didn't solve all the problems or fix things. And in fact, the Japanese were kicking our asses. And here we are designing what we're saying are world class high performing factories, and they're getting their butts kicked. Why are they
Mhm.
getting their butts kicked? And so I rode the total quality movement. I learned what single minute exchange of dies meant. I learned what, what um, cycle time was, and
Mhm. Right.
I learned customer satisfaction from the Japanese. I
Mhm.
learned resistance is a gift from the Japanese. Right? They're the ones that told me that they love complaints. And they're the ones that gave me the phrase gems to be mined. Right? They said, complaints are gems to be mined. I thought that's not a North American, it's not a
Mhm.
Western point of view. Right.
Right.
So, so I've ridden waves, and out of the total quality movement came things like agile.
Mhm.
I think I've been successful over the years because I've been able to ride each of these waves. And a little bit of it is pushing yourself to your comfort zones. I'm working on the book. We have an AI agent that we've trained as a part of our book writing team.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I like it, but I'm learning from it and it makes me feel uncomfortable. Um, but I don't know any other way to do it other than to lean into it.
As you think about um, the work that you do, the amount of time that you contribute to developing practitioners personally, how do you think about that? Where does that fit in? When did that start?
I was fortunate to be mentored by three people. Eric Trist, a guy by the name of Noriaki Kano in Japan, who took me under his wing at Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers and opened doors for me to visit factories and talk to Japanese scientists and leaders. And Kano took a liking to me. And he was an amazing kind of guy. The third is a professor at Purdue who, um, when I was working for Babcock and Wilcox, I hired as a consultant. Jack's going to be 93 next week. Um, but he was his own person, and he was an amazing thinker, very empathic. He
Hmm.
could read a room in about 4 minutes. His partner was more the egghead intellectual. Um, but I watched Jack work with this group of people, and I never saw him. I've known him for 50 years. I never saw him with a pair of socks. I learned a lot from Jack as a practitioner, and he actually was one of my professors in my graduate program. Um, the other was Dana Miller. The other was Dana Miller. Um, Being with her and watching her do things, so I've been touched by four people. If four people could say they've been touched by me,
Hmm.
I'd be happy, right? That's the gift of mentoring. So I think it's my responsibility to leave the world in a better place. So I'm always looking for that. The EODF is founded on the notion that you can't do this by yourself. It's not the work of an individual, it's the work of a community. And if you don't have a community to support you, it's a lonely business.
Hmm.
And I always say, I never don't let me work alone because I'll scare the shit out of you. I mean, I'm liable to go off on crazy tangents and do offer crazy things. I need somebody to a countervailing force that balance in somewhere. But there are things, Brandon, like when you and I met on that bus, you weren't braggadocio. You were as curious as you were, right? You were as inquisitive as you were interesting, right? And so there, I mean, I run into people all the time, and some of them stick because they have certain characteristics. They're open, they're inquisitive, they're thoughtful, they're smart, um, they're willing to push the edges of their own thinking. They're willing to challenge the status quo. But so on the bus, that's what attracted me to you,
Hmm.
right? You asked a lot of questions. We had a lot of fun at the game.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and you were inquisitive, right? Thoughtful, inquisitive, connected to people that I knew, right? And honestly impacted by people that I know
Mhm.
who impacted me as well, right? So we share that. There'll be a day where you will say or do something with a client,
Mhm.
and it will remind you where it came from.
Mhm.